Like, we live in a really bigoted country. We live in a country where xenophobia is acceptable to a degree, misogyny is acceptable to a degree, and racism is acceptable to a degree. Why would we expect anti-Semitism to be different? Are Jews really so exceptional? And the answer I came to is no.
Hi, this is Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and you're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News that takes a zoomed-out look at the place of Jews in North American society today. My guest today is Ari Y. Kelman. He is the Jim Joseph Professor of Education and Jewish Studies and Associate Professor by courtesy of Religious Studies at Stanford University. He also, much like myself, has a doctorate from New York University, but not everybody can make it as a podcaster. Some people are forced to be Stanford professors. I am sorry about that for you. I've invited him on today because of a really, really fabulous, thought-provoking essay of his in ARC that came out on October 6th called More Than Zero, 2 years after the Hamas attacks, Jews must be content to flourish with a certain amount of anti-Semitism. The article caught my attention because it's so at odds with basically everything one reads on this topic. It's not yet another article, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, but it's not even an article about why Jews need to find meaning beyond the fight against anti-Semitism. It's an essay about learning to live with anti-Semitism and anti-Semites, which we may have to do. Professor Kelman, Ari, how would you like to be called? Welcome to the Jewish Angle.
Ari's great. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So my first question for you is just about this zero tolerance policy on anti-Semitism, because I know what you mean, but I'm wondering when you first started seeing this, and more specifically, to what extent it's a post-October 7th phenomenon versus, I'm thinking of like Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. That came out in 2019, was a post-Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting. She's from there. Anyway, when did you first start picking up on this?
I don't really know. It was definitely before October 7th. It was probably before COVID, so probably before 2020 when I started back in the sort of late teens and started really grappling with anti-Semitism as a significant feature of American society and trying to figure out where Jews fit amongst other minorities in America. And we are seeing in the late teens a resurgence of all kinds of bigotry in the United States. And then the ADL would, appear and say, sort of put out fires here and put out fires there with respect to anti-Semitism, right? This is like back in the day when like the ADL was hired by Starbucks and there was a tussle about whether or not they had the sensitivity to do the sort of work that Starbucks meant. Sort of back then, I don't remember. And it occurred to me that it's chutzpahdik that Jews should expect that there would be no anti-Semitism in America, that every little thing needed a kind of ferocious and total response. It just seemed out of step with what was becoming normalized in America, which was a certain amount of kind of baseless hatred of different groups. And it occurred to me at some point in there, and I don't remember when, that Jews are just going to have to live with, like, we live in a really bigoted country. We live in a country where xenophobia is acceptable to a degree, misogyny is acceptable to a degree, and racism is acceptable to a degree. Why would we expect anti-Semitism to be different? Are Jews really so exceptional? And the answer I came to is no. And so the idea germinated for a long time. And actually, so it germinated for a long time before October 7th.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a couple things that come up in your piece and just sort of thinking about that period generally. So there are kind of two things going on. There's this idea of kind of stamping out all bigotry, which you see beyond just the Jewish community, this idea of like getting rid of all hatred. But also there was, and I'll get back to that because there I have many, many questions. But there was also this period of time during which sounds like we both came of age that was a uniquely sort of not anti-Semitism free, but like a real ebb. Like there was much less anti-Semitism, certainly in the United States. I did not grow up in Canada. I cannot reverse time. I can't retroactively have grown up Canadian. But so how much is this like to do with a specific situation where American Jews knew a world, like I'm 42, I knew a world where anti-Semitism seemed kind of like it had been. Like, it's almost as like measles, you know what I mean? Like, these things seem like they were gone, and then, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on. So one is exactly this. I'm 54. Like you and I grew up in a time, and I grew up in California, like where I did not encounter anti-Semitism. I knew it existed. I knew it had existed, but I didn't encounter it on the daily, and I certainly didn't encounter it like as a regular feature of my life growing up. Um, and then so there's that, and I think that to a degree, and there's kind of one, I think there's one paragraph in the essay that really does this, where I'm like, we like American Jews lost the muscle. Like there was back in the early 2020s, there was all this sort of media coverage of like when African American parents have the talk with their kids, you know. And the talk in the Jewish world tended to be about the Holocaust, which for anti-Semitism is like a very high bar. But there was no the talk about contemporary anti-Semitism because, by and large, it didn't exist, and even the major Jewish organizations, you know, didn't sort of deal with it as a regular feature of American Jewish life. Scholars didn't really study it in any serious way. I think that was probably an oversight on our part. Like we missed a lot of things, but there was really when I was teaching, when I first got into this gig and was teaching, and I was looking for resources on American anti-Semitism. There's one book, Leonard Dinnerstein's book on anti-Semitism in America, and there were articles here and there, but it wasn't like a major area of study. Um, and then when I went back and I looked at how people were talking about anti-Semitism in the '60s, you know, there's that article by Sclair that I cited in the article where he's like, yeah, it's down to about 25% of people who think that Jews have terrible qualities. We're good. Like he was pretty excited about that. Um, and so it was those things that I was thinking about, and I think the absence of continued exposure to anti-Semitism made it so that when anti-Semitism really began to surge in the late teens, American Jews and American Jewish organizations, they were anchored to an experience in which anti-Semitism wasn't a prevalent aspect of American culture, but also they didn't have the resources to deal with it in any kind of sophisticated way. So the response became, you know, it's impossible. It can't be here. Um, we need to sort of wipe it all out. This kind of call for zero tolerance, as opposed to an adjustment to the reality, which was, well, maybe those last 60 years were actually the aberration historically, and we need to think of ourselves not as kind of like this anti-Semitism ascendant, as like that's where we ought to be, but maybe maybe we were the unusual people at that moment historically, and we needed to readjust to the mean, which was a certain amount of anti-Semitism is just part of the world in which we live.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back to that era, and I'm thinking specifically of the character of Uncle Leo on the sitcom Seinfeld, who's this character who plays the Jerry Seinfeld character's uncle. He's a bit older. He sees anti-Semitism everywhere, and this is played as a joke, basically. And I think what I remember from the sort of golden age or whatever, to borrow the Franklin Four way of looking at it, is like if you talked about anti-Semitism a lot, you seemed of another era. You seemed to be maybe making light of the problems of real marginalized groups, but mainly you just seemed sort of like oblivious, sort of paranoid, hypersensitive. Then, though, you get to kind of the, late 2010s, 2020, 2021 moment, and everybody's sort of looking with a microscope for everything that could offend anybody, and that's where kind of so my next question is gonna be about, something that it's later in your piece, it's not what you put front and center. It is kind of, I think, really, really central to figuring out what all of this is, and I'm gonna quote from your piece. You write, "Buying into the false logic of, quote, microaggressions will serve Jews as poorly as as it serves other minority groups," end quote. So this made me think of the Jewish students who used safe spaces language to talk about their discomfort with campus encampment protests. And they hadn't come up with this idea on their own. This wasn't something specific to Jewish students, but it was how students from marginalized groups had been encouraged to speak about their feelings and to make demands on administrations. So I guess what I want to ask you is, like, you don't unpack this in the piece, understandably so. It's not really like what your piece is about, but to talk about it with you here now, like, is this something that's like it's a problem when Jews do this, or is it more like that this is a strategy for fighting bigotry that just sort of doesn't work? I have my own thoughts on this that I'm not holding forth on
I,
right now,
I'd love to
but
hear what you have to what you think about it. My thought is that the sort of safe spaces lot. I mean, yeah, this isn't the students' fault. They were they had come up under conditions on college campuses in which that was the way one expressed the sense that there was bigotry on campus or something. And sometimes it was not expressed. Sometimes even within that kind of like discourse, um, it was people overplayed their hands. Um, but that was the rules. There's an office. You make a complaint to the office responds. At least on my campus, like that was kind of how it worked. I think it's generally the way it worked on many campuses. And I think what Jewish students found was that they were like, but we're playing by the rules. We're lodging complaints with the right people. We're using the language of safe space, which seemed to buy other groups all kinds of accommodations and attention. Why aren't we being heard in the same way? And I think for me, like that's not a microaggressions. It's not an instance of microaggressions. It's more an instance of like the failure of that sort of informal campus compact around student conduct and the way that students treat one another and treated one another. That is, the Jewish students. My experience of the past 2 years has been that the Jewish students frequently said, "Well, these are the rules. We're trying to play by those discursive rules, not procedural rules or administrative rules, but we're trying to play by the discursive rules, and we're not being heard." And that's a huge problem, I think. And I think that it exposed many of the issues that were sort of simmering beneath the surface in the broader kind of discourse of DEI on college campuses that many people knew about. I mean, if you work on a campus, and you're like, that's like, but that's why I ultimately kept coming back um, to rat parts in the sausage. Like there's always going to be rat parts to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, where he's, doing this journalistic expose on meatpacking plants. And, you know, the book, The Jungle, did a lot toward making meat plants safer and processed meat safer. But it's not about getting rid of all the rat parts in the sausage. It's about accepting a tolerable amount of rat parts in the sausage. And there's always going to be rat parts in the sausage.
well, I'm tempted to ask you now whether you're a vegetarian because having heard that, I have vegetarian leanings, and I think this may have been the line that made it more absolute. But yeah, I mean, what's so interesting is like my next question is going to kind of bring us to the now. But even though we have, we not in Canada, but in the States, there's now this situation of only Jews' complaints about discrimination count, which is it leads to its own problems. But there is still something where it does seem like there's this dynamic where whether it's anti-Semitism or misogyny or racism or any form of bigotry, trying to kind of stamp out any tiny, possibly inadvertent, especially the stuff that comes from somebody who's well-meaning and just misspeaks or something like that, seems to backfire in different ways that maybe are not so productive. But I want to talk, though, just directly to stay on this topic of the campus life. Another quote from your piece that really stood out for me. The fantasy that anti-Semitism can be driven down to zero has allowed American politicians to use anti-Semitism as an excuse to pummel American higher education, punish students, and bully faculty. That anti-Semitism is often merely an excuse for draconian actions has been obvious to everyone who is paying attention, end quote. So regular listeners to the Jewish angle and people who read my column in the Canadian Jewish News are among the ranks of the paying attention when it comes to the pretext stuff. But I would like you to expand on this and specifically connect it to the whole idea of zero tolerance. Because I think people are familiar with, who are listening to this, probably are going to be familiar with like Trump cracking down on higher ed and saying it's because anti-Semitism and I don't know. But where does the zero tolerance aspect enter into it?
Well, yeah, I mean, the weird thing about that, well, I mean, Trump, as so many people have written before I did, right? It was anti-Semitism and Jews were a convenient way to dismantle DEI efforts, ironically leaving only anti-Semitism as the sole sort of possible place in which one could lodge a complaint, which is a problem because there is still all these other things on campus, and it doesn't help us solve the problems on campus life of when students do things that are maybe protected speech by the Constitution, but maybe aren't the kind of discourse that we want to encourage in our students. And students, they're 18 to 21, their prefrontal cortexes aren't like fully developed. They do all kinds of stupid stuff all the time. And what is the job of the university in terms of trying to cultivate thoughtful, intelligent, informed people, and how much appetite is there for allowing students to say things maybe that were hurtful to one another, and then giving the other students the strength and or the sort of tools with which to deal with interpersonal conflict, which is also not great. So I think that to me is the sort of the policy question part of it. I think the other part of your question about zero tolerance, again, like if the last 40 years of American Jewish life, maybe 50 years, have been marked by a sense that zero anti-Semitism or very, very low anti-Semitism is normal. And so the desire to go back to that, I think, fails to recognize that we don't live in the world of the 1970s anymore, even the 1980s. We live in the world of the 2020s. And the world of the 2020s is one in which speech is unchecked. For some people, the more hateful you are, the more attention you get. It's a virtue in your political circles. And I'm not saying we need to encourage that, but once everybody under every rock and corner has a microphone and a podcast, you're going to get opinions and you're going to get voices that didn't have access to mainstream, didn't have access to broadcast platforms, and you're going to get all kinds of things. And that's, again, I'm trying to help the Jewish communities of North America take a good, cold, hard look at the country in which we live and the countries in which we live and the world in which we live, so that they can actually develop tools to deal with that reality as opposed to trying to pull us back to a reality that it no longer holds.
No, I think that makes sense. So as a practical matter, how does opposing anti-Semitism without trying to eliminate it differ from a zero tolerance approach? Because you write, another quote, anti-Semitism is a problem in contemporary America on both the political right and the political left. Um, and you continue, wherever possible, it should be identified, addressed, and opposed, and its proponents should be held responsible for their views, end quote. So it's not that you're saying that anti-Semitism should be given a pass. You're certainly not saying it doesn't exist, and you're not saying that people should just say, "Ah, there it is. There's some more anti-Semitism. Who cares?" But like, as a practical matter, what do you think? Like, how does it look different to say zero tolerance versus, you know, not some tolerance?
Yeah. I mean, this year at school, people keep asking me, or, you know, how's everything on campus, sort of conspiratorially. And I say, like, it's fine. Like, it's quiet is what I say usually, which is true. Politically quiet feels very normal, which feels weirdly abnormal for the world that we live in. But anyway, um, but I don't think anybody's attitudes have changed. I don't think anybody's opinions have changed. They're just not saying them out loud, which allows a certain amount of kind of social interaction to go on smoothly. But it hasn't lowered my sense of suspicion or other people's sense of suspicion. And I don't think it's made things like, it's made things smoother, but I don't actually think that anybody's fundamental ideas have changed. And that's not getting rid of anti-Semitism. It's just opting for a kind of surface level zero tolerance where now there's no outward expressions of anti-Semitism, but I don't know what people are thinking, and people are afraid to speak and afraid to do
Are there
things.
outward expressions of other forms of bigotry that there weren't in the past?
Not that I know of. They're probably also the same, which is to say infrequent, um, but present. So it's hard to say. And I mean, look, if I knew how to fight it, I would be out there with like a really good idea. I don't know. But I don't think that asking for absolute zero is like, if I think about an educational context, I try to have an educational outcome that is for my students attainable, a stretch, but attainable. And then my job is to create conditions in which they can reach that outcome, understanding a concept, mastering a body of literature, whatever, making an argument. But the outcome has to be attainable. And I think pushing for absolute zero is an unattainable outcome. And it means that you then put yourself in a position where you don't have the tools to attain, like, to reach the outcome. So let's try to reach a reasonable outcome, which is some measure of, we're just going to have some measure of anti-Semitism in America, but call it out, routinely call it out when you see it, fight it where it shows up, make your voices heard. But don't expect it to go away, and expect that the terrain of anti-Semitism in America is going to remain fairly variable, and that sometimes there are going to be flare-ups and sometimes there's going to be relative quietude. But it's always going to be there. And I don't think we can make the mistake that we made in the 70s, 80s, 90s and think that quiet means that it's not there. I think we have to expect that it's there. So when it flares up, we actually have the tools to deal with the flare-up as a feature of living in the world that we live in.
There's an article by Matthew Iglesias in The Argument called Bigots in the Tent. It came out October 22nd, that I think covers kind of similar terrain, even though it's not about anti-Semitism specifically, but it's about kind of like, yeah, walking that line between like having the Democratic Party accept that there are going to be people in it who hold views that others in the Democratic Party view as bigoted, while not going as far as being kind of like a haven for bigots, for the openly bigoted. I'm quoting from his article now. One gets the sense that for many younger Republicans in particular, openness to racism is in fact the core appeal of the party. There is a world of difference between a political movement led by non-racists trying to exercise some restraint in how high it sets the bar, and a movement willfully wallowing in bigotry. End quote. I was just thinking of this as like one, not to like turn this into a discussion of, partisan politics, but just like that this is that there are distinctions, right? Like there's the alternative to, like, I think that in the 2010s and early 2020s, it really seemed like either you were for zero tolerance of bigotry or you were pro bigotry. And it seems like we're maybe now seeing kind of like in your essay, maybe a little bit more broadly, this kind of like what actually works. You know what I mean?
I think perhaps one of the ways, now I'm maybe speaking out of school because this is beyond my like area of expertise, but like maybe one of the ways that the American left went off the rails a bit was expecting the whole country is going to come its way on certain things, and really put up these hard guardrails. I think there are hard guardrails that are really good and useful, but I think in terms of these sort of systemic kinds of perspectives, I think we can always expect some of it, and then we should do our best, and we should be our best equipped to fight them when they come up. But I don't think that we should sort of delude ourselves into thinking it's possible to get rid of them entirely. I think that delusion leads people toward making partnerships or trying to enact things that are not ultimately for the benefit of the most people possible, including the very people that you're trying to protect. So you end up with Jewish community leaders supporting Trump's efforts to silence people on campus in a way that actually doesn't benefit, I think, students in general, and certainly not campus life, and maybe not even the very Jewish students who they're supposedly protecting.
The reason I bring this up so frequently on a Canadian Jewish podcast, and I know it's Canadian, I am sitting right here in Canada now. I know I'm in Canada, and I am even Canadian also these days. But I bring it up because the Canadian Jewish community is often tempted to go into that sort of deeper crackdown approach. And I completely sympathize with why. There are plenty of instances of anti-Semitism in Canada. This is not in anybody's imagination. But I think that current situation in the U.S. offers a bit of a cautionary tale of like what happens if the government, the whole "be careful what you wish for" thing. Like it could, it's not necessarily that more cracking down on anti-Semitism from the government helps. I do have, though, a question about the U.S. So again, apologies to my fellow Canadians, but between inviting you on to this podcast and or actually speaking, there have been at least 3 stories in the news about, you know, maybe secret Nazis, maybe not, in U.S. politics. One was there was this Politico expose about young Republicans and their group chats, um, where they, I guess, express admiration for Hitler. I think that was that one, and other they say other similarly interesting things. Then there's Paul Ingracia, who was trying to be to lead the office of
Right.
special counsel. Sounds like he's not going to be doing that. Who, in his own, these people have some interesting group chats, referred to his own Nazi streak. And then finally, because there's got to be a Democrat in the mix too, why leave all the fun to the Republicans? There is a Maine oyster farmer named Graham Plattner, who is running for Senate with Bernie Sanders' support, and who I was going to say, when I even did the notes on this, I wrote, has a Nazi tattoo. Since then, he has covered it up. He has had it covered up. It, it's if you choose, you listener, to look up what this looked like before it looks like now, that is something you can live with. Uh, it's not very elegant, but it's, I guess, not as Nazi-ish as it had been. I actually had not personally known this was a Nazi symbol, the skull and crossbones. I would have thought he was just trying to look hardcore. Whether he knew it or not is its own question. I've been going on for a while, but the reason I mention all of these is sort of like, first of all, like, what's the best way to deal with incidents like this? Or is it even possible to group them together? Are they kind of each a different thing?
I mean, from my from my perspective, they're all evidence of what American culture really is, right? People used to talk in the way that they talk on group chats, just not on group chats, but now we have group chats, so we have the receipts. But I don't think those conversations were any less sort of present in American politics 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I think they were always there. And those views were always there. Now they just get surfaced because everything is recorded. So I think it's just evidence of where we are, and I think that just means we have to get smarter about fighting them. We can't expect they don't exist. We should expect them to exist, so we're not blindsided every time they are. And then God willing, the organizations within which these people work, whatever that is, have the fortitude to say, yeah, we don't want people who hold those views working for us. But you probably heard JD Vance, oh, boys will be boys kind of thing. And that they were just making jokes and isn't it funny? Without any saying like, yeah, they like, I'll give them the most generous read and say, yes, they were all being very funny and ironic. But nobody that I have heard anyway, and certainly not the Vice President of the United States, was saying, yeah, they thought they were funny. Those are not funny. And we're going to fire them or tell them that they're not funny. Like, of course we should be fighting them. And of course they should be held responsible for the words that they say and the views that they hold. I should hold them responsible if I think their views are odious. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I hope, and I'm routinely disappointed, that the leaders of the countries on our continent, or maybe the leaders in the world, share a similar sense that kind of those kinds of attitudes are not the kind of attitudes that we want in the halls of power and the people making decisions, because I think they're bad for everybody. But I'm maybe not taking my own advice.
Professor Ari Y. Kelman, thank you so much for coming on The Jewish Angle. This has been fascinating, and listeners, I promise, with plenty of Canadian applications. Fear not. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Go Blue Jays.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Fraiman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.